Gamers! This video is sponsored by War Thunder.
Episode 63, yep, that's right, has another cold open with a out-of-breath Falco running into Reiner. As the violin version of Memory Lane plays, Reiner asks, what is he up to this late? Only for Falco to respond that he has apparently forgotten something. Right away, I think this achieves a couple of different things. Number one, it's just a cheeky little Chekhov's gun, and I think by now all of us know that Isayama, he very much likes a good Chekhov's gun. And with this particular letter, there is also a whole separate through line with Eren's grandfather. We'll get to it later in the episode, but Eren explicitly asks Falco to leave the internment zone so that the letter is not searched. Thing is, leaving the internment zone is kind of a very, very bad omen for Eren's grandfather, and that's exactly what we'll be seeing. But number two, just like Reiner's panic attack was also set to the very nostalgic Memory Lane, only the guitar version, this act of kindness from Falco, also being corrupted, is just that classic whiplash that Attack on Titan always does. In his mind, he's just being a nice guy delivering his traumatized friends' letters, but in reality, that letter is quite literally inviting their enemies into their home. So when you rewatch the scene, and you hear that warm and fuzzy Memory Lane tune, and then you realize that Falco is being burdened with something horrible, it's the death of hundreds, including his own friends, well, that warmth in the scene becomes a whole lot darker and a whole lot more insidious. Something we'd also be seeing with the Reiner and Eren conversation, but now we're getting ahead of ourselves. And on that note, the title of the episode is From Hand to Hand, referencing the letter and its journey to Eren's allies. But as always, I think the title also calls for a little bit of overanalyzing. This episode doesn't deal with just a simple favor from Falco. All of this episode has layers and layers of politics, cloak and dagger narratives, and a number of personal deals all being spun at the same time. There's all the back and forth between Magath and Willy about what their roles would be in the post-festival world. There's Eren and Zeke working on overthrowing this entire thing. There's the Atsumabito family and a bunch more families all feigning allegiances to Marley, and so on. So really, a whole lot of trust and a whole lot of plans are always being passed from one hand to another. And that is exactly where we open. Magath suddenly learning that the Tybur family has already arrived. An absolute unit of a man opens the doors, which is very funny and everything, but the more important thing here is what all of this says about the Marley population and the prejudice against Eldians. Willy, and the Tybur family as a whole, is another living, breathing example of how ridiculously backward this entire Eldian Devils thing is. Just last episode, we saw Karina talk about how Eldians and Marleyans could not be together because they have devil's blood in their veins. And even after Reiner became a warrior, absolutely nothing changed. He was an honorary Marleyan in title, but he was still just Reiner, right? Nothing changed. He was still the same Eldian devil. Thing is, the entire Tybur family are also Eldians, and so they also have quote-unquote devil's blood in their veins, but because they've been nobility for as long as Marley has existed, well, Lord Tybur it is. If you remember what we talked about a few episodes prior about these convenient narratives, well, with Tybur, that narrative is no longer convenient, so it is conveniently forgotten about. And if you do a little bit of overanalyzing, Willy himself would acknowledge exactly this. In this episode, he talks about how he too is one of those devils and he must atone for his sins. But at the same time, and he'd explicitly vocalized this during the festival, everything he is doing is to get rid of that distinction altogether, saying he wants to live because he was born into this world. So if last time we talked about how Eren and Reiner are exactly the same, but also very different, then Willy is kinda sorta right in between the two and drawing on both of their ideologies. He isn't like Zeke, who believes that life as a whole is suffering and that they should simply cease to exist. But he also believes that a price must be paid for the suffering that he has inflicted and allowed to be inflicted upon the world. He will sacrifice thousands and he will become a martyr for them, but he wants them to live because they were born into this world. Hold that thought for now. Also, this is like a complete side note, but I still can't get over how uncanny seeing actual suits in Attack on Titan is. Even rewatching like dozens of times, and obviously knowing full well that this is just a version of the real world, it still catches me off guard like each and every time. I am expecting like ODM gear and Marleyan uniforms and stuff like that, and suddenly there's just a suit, and I'm like, wait, something's not right, I recognize that, that's not fantasy. Very luxurious drip aside, it is time for politics. Willy says he came here to look at the statue of Helos, beginning to retell a story of him, a mere human, defeating the Devil of the Earth 100 years ago. And actually, before we get to politics, there's a bunch of symbolism around Helos and Willy. First off, just like Ymir's deal with the Devil of all things, this too is obviously just a myth. When Willy describes it as the true spirit of Marley, Magath even bluntly notes, yes, truly, the statue is hollow after all, clearly throwing a jab at this shallow mythology. Magath is a smart dude, but he doesn't really like playing politics. Like we already saw in the trenches with him taking Colt's advice on board, he doesn't care much for this bad Eldian, good Eldian nonsense either. When it comes down to it and bullets start whizzing over their heads, they are all the same, and so he very bluntly calls out the statue for the shallow posturing that it is. It's just a shell built around an empty, or worse yet, rotten and rat-infested core. As for where the story might have been derived from, it is reminiscent of Ymir being skewered, but that doesn't really make much sense considering, the Titan splitting process started with Ymir's death. So even if they wanted to mythologize Ymir's death, it seems kinda goofy to use the start of the Great Titan War as the ending of their tale. So in my opinion, I think it's just meant to be this ultimate expression of the power of man, just like we've seen many times on Paradis. Another smart blondie that we know described the scouts as analogous to the Walls' spear. So I think this imagery of a single man bringing down a monster with just a basic spear is just a dramatized version of that ideal, almost fantastical hero. Finally getting into the politics though, and straight up, I don't know how Isayama did it, but he somehow managed to make Willy and Magath some of the most compelling characters in a few episodes. This entire episode of their conversation is something that I would have paid good money to see more of. Please, Isayama, write the Great Titan War prequel. Please give me a Game of Thrones story and Attack on Titan. Magath talks about how for the people of Marley, war only exists in newspapers. They keep getting quote-unquote stronger, all without lifting a finger. That's why they chose to reinstate the draft. He wants the population to be scared of what they're actually supporting. In a series that is all about blind conflicts, the big bad Commander Magath is actually using his position to put an end to Marley's self-destructive cycle. He knows full well that these conquered nations, they are not allies. They are effectively prisoners, not helped by the fact that the Marley population is brainwashed to the point of being blind to reason because, boo, Eldian devil. The average Marleyan citizen is currently living with zero accountability for what the military state of Marley is doing. They just support it because it's always been that way. Problem is, in episode 61, we already heard Magath criticize their reliance on Titans. The only thing they've done is strengthen the world's resolve to push technology forward and simply invalidate the power of the Titans altogether. Despite all of their conquest, he knows that at this point in history, Marley is the weakest it has ever been. And even more than that, in the previous episode, Eren talked about how if people knew the true cost of war, the toll it takes on their minds and bodies, no one would ever step foot on a battlefield. That is exactly what Magath is saying here. The only reason the average Marleyan doesn't care the least bit about anything going on is because they have no involvement in it. And worse yet, they benefit from Marley's conquest. He wants to expose them to the harsh reality of what they are supporting, or rather their inaction is supporting, with the expectation that most will immediately buckle under the pressure. So again, in a story that is all about blind hatred and a nation that believes in a fantastical but totally hollow beast-slaying man, would it really be a stretch to say that Magath is the one who is actually capable of saving Marley and perhaps stopping this war altogether? His solution is not a fairy tale, nor is it a perfectly calculated plan with distinct goals. No, it is just a bitter reality check that will involve a whole lot of death and pain. But only once they themselves have gone through that would lead to a more rational Marley. Now, Magath is still a product of Marley, and while he doesn't necessarily throw aside all Eldians, he does clearly put Marleyans above them. So it's not like his goals are entirely pure either. But in a story that is all about the cycle of vengeance, this is a almost frightening amount of reason. And because Isayama was writing straight fire, we must have that point of contrast, right? That is exactly what Willy is. He is the ultimate form of what Magath is describing. Ever since the Tybur family conspired with Fritz about the construction of Paradis, they just stood by and watched as their fellow Eldians were used and abused right here on the mainland, all the while retaining absolute authority over Marley that they just never exercised. For years, they convinced themselves that not interfering in Marley's goals or desires is their way of atonement for the sins of their ancestors. In reality, though, they are no better than the average Marleyan supporting Marley's conquest. Their inaction is what brought this cycle of destruction. It's that same angle of inheritance that we've seen many times both on Paradis as well as right here in Marley. The Tybur family inherits this preconceived sin, and just like the royals of Paradis, they pass down the Warhammer while being the only ones in the mainland to actually know how the Great Titan War ended. So on both sides, the royalty is very, very similar. We interrupt this program to bring you a message from our sponsors. If you have ever wanted to be an epic vehicle commander, War Thunder is the best place to do it. With over 2,000 unique tanks, planes, helicopters, fighter jets, ships, and armored cars, this is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. And the game is free. Every single vehicle is crafted with immersion in mind. From the realistic graphics to the authentic sound effects, it will make you feel like you are right there in the intense combat zone piloting the most powerful war machines of today. Master the skies in fast and snappy air combat. Captain your own warship and lead a fleet into battle. Fast or slow, there's a game mode for everyone. It's even got beautiful X-ray visualizations to make those head-on hits feel all the more satisfying to watch. And when you want to take a quick break from the action, spend hours customizing your war machine to make it look exactly how you want it to. We all know looking good means playing better, right? Very recently, the game also got a mobile version, so you can do all of that on the go. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile devices by using my links in the description. And better yet, for new players or returning players who haven't played in the last 6 months, there is also a massive bonus package waiting for you. It includes multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive vehicle decorator, 7 days of a premium account, and much more. Do note that the sign-up bonus is only available to PC and console players. It's only available for a limited time, so don't miss it. As for Willy though, he is a very interesting personality that I don't think we really see in anyone else. On one hand, he is an idealist and he is a dreamer. He wants to become their Helos, he wants to bring an end to this conflict, to somehow make up for his perceived sins of his ancestors, to finally tear down that barrier between Marleyan and Eldian because they were all born into this world. But at the same time, his outlook on life and the world as a whole is also very bleak. He embodies that belief of King Fritz that the sins of the Eldians are too great and that when their time came, he'd welcome it. He did genuinely think that he had to pay for their sins. It's hard to say how much of that is guilt over him specifically, never interfering in Marley's subjugation of their fellow Eldians, and how much of that is just this blanket belief that all Eldians are in some way tainted, but I always read it as it more so being a focus on the former. I think for him, it's that inactivity that hurts infinitely more, and also why Magath ends up being the person that Willy works hand in hand with. Magath criticizing the Marleyan population for their ignorant support of the military is music to Willy's ears, because finally, there is someone who understands. And so, he says that it is their inaction that has plunged both Marley and Eldia into this dark age, both quickly speeding toward their own destruction, saying that they will reveal everything at the festival. So essentially, what this conversation explores is the horrifying realization that that wheel of hatred is spinning so fast that stopping it might no longer be possible. It is their inaction that allowed it to keep barreling along. It's a conversation about how even a small conflict, a small belief, a small dispute can become something incomprehensible if the population at large remains ignorant. I always talk about how Attack on Titan is a story about conflict as a sort of idea. I purposely don't rope in historical examples because there are so many of them because, again, it is exploring the idea of conflict and hatred. And with something like this, it's the same thing all over again. I don't think you really need to think far. Quote-unquote small regional disputes that somehow end up sparking a massive war? Quote-unquote small isolated incidents of extreme dissenting opinions that somehow end up splitting entire countries? When the silent majority becomes dismissive and turns a blind eye, those sparks and embers of radicalism can quickly burn down the entire thing. That is what Magath and Willy realize. Also, complete side note, I really don't think people think about how insane this conversation is in the first place. Willy is a royal of the highest stature. Magath is just a basic commander, and he's out here putting out the boldest takes of all time and low-key dismissing their own nation, which, if a royal wanted to think that that is treason, that's treason. So, yeah, Magath, very bold man. Also, this conversation happening right in the shadow of Helos is a really cool bit of cinematography. And also, I won't even talk about the scene because it is beyond cursed. We then cut to Reiner giving their superiors intel on Paradis, which I think is another excellent showcase of Marley's entirely hollow, reckless, status-centric society. As we saw a few episodes prior, despite being a full-blown warrior and even their quote-unquote golden boy, Zeke actually talking in a meeting was still a big deal. Because he was very assertive with what he said though, his proposal was actually taken into consideration. With Reiner on the other hand, he gives them very valuable information, which by the way, we as the neutral observer know to be perfectly accurate. But because he never insisted on anything being done his way or really any kind of plan, both he and all of his suggestions are just brushed off. They even pull the whole an Eldian shouldn't have been allowed to speak in the first place. This is that hollow Helos comment personified. They dismiss an actual soldier's first-hand experience and continue posturing because the solution wasn't handed to them on a silver platter. It's all about just keeping up appearances, even if the core is hollow, or in this case, incredibly reckless and dangerous. And as a direct callback to that, we see Magath looking very judgmental in the corner, but never speaking a word. As we cut to the warriors after the meeting, they all goof around about their commanders being very good commanders. But Peak again notes just how ridiculous this plan of sending 4 kids again really is. We talked about the rationale behind it last time, so I won't rehash that again, but the important thing with these 4 is that they, or at least what remains of them, would indeed buck the trend. That is in large part because Marley is already fracturing and is no longer the monolithic military power that it once was, but we would also see how that cycle of inheritance has finally caught up to them. More on that soon, TM. Speaking of bucking trends though, another one is Falco actually managing to beat Gabby in a race. And while it's super wholesome on the surface with even this super jazzy triumphant guitar playing in the background, it is also very, very morbid because, you know, getting the Titan is signing your own death warrant, and we are celebrating it for some reason. But the whole, I care about you, what do you mean you care about me, you're trying to stop me from getting what I want debacle, and all of them going shopping, I think is just a nice bit of levity before all the craziness. If you really wanted to overanalyze, you can even draw an explicit parallel between Season 1 and this. The young recruits are all exhausted from training, but finally they have this brief moment of respite where they can just munch on some nice fresh bread. But by the end of, coincidentally, episode 4 of their respective seasons, an old enemy appears for the first time in not quite the same, but 4 to 5 years. Tinfoil aside, like many times before, I think is just there to establish tonal contrast, and that's it. While they're goofing around town though, we still get a number of very layered scenes, one of them being at the theater site. First off, this being a literal theater is obviously incredibly ironic since, you know, this whole parody Devil, Marley, and Hero thing is indeed just fictional theater. They are quite literally setting the stage for the destruction of Paradis, where Willy's death is the tragic twist in the second act of the play. As for Gabby's squad, she talks about how the world leaders will all meet up and formally declare war on Paradis. To which Udo sarcastically responds with, "Oh wow, so all of Marley's problems will just disappear." Much like we saw with Reiner's squad and him blindly repeating Marleyan propaganda, Gabby is genuinely confused because why wouldn't the world ally with the great Marleyan nation in their noble pursuit of defeating the devils? Udo, on the other hand, is much closer to Annie with his perspective, with him saying, obviously it's not going to work. Do they really expect countless, forcefully coerced nations to just suddenly ally in fighting against what is basically a god? With him then adding that, Eldians are treated even worse in other internment zones. It just won't happen. And really overanalyzing here, if you want to talk about the Paradisian devils and Ymir making a deal with the devil of all things, then this festival right here is effectively making a deal with the devil. Its nations conquered yesterday, being told that they need to fight their own people tomorrow. Obviously, there is going to be resistance. And if a kid can figure that out, then our resident big brains certainly can as well, and so we cut to another meeting between Magath and Willy. Most of this conversation is spoken in roundabouts and metaphors, like there being rats in the house and one pillar is holding it up because it's all top secret classified false flag shenanigans. But like super TLDR, Willy is the one actually pulling the strings behind everything going on. Now that he has found Magath, who actually wants to change Marley's self-destructive warmongering ways, Willy gives him command over the entire military. Not in a meaningless rank way, but in actual control behind the scenes facilitated through the royal family. And so, in this grandiose festival held by the royal Tybur family, the first step is just a simple seeding plan. The large-scale demolition, as Willy puts it. They put every single important general in one spot. The place that Eren, or any other opposition, would naturally beeline. And so, once the military command is all wiped out, Magath is the one firing the first shots. Now we're jumping ahead a little, but we'd see this paid off beautifully with episode 70. Magath initially talks about how they should wait for the Alliance to actually get together. But just like we saw in the meeting in this episode, Reiner steps in saying that is exactly what Zeke expects, saying if they wait, they along with all of their barely solidified allies will be crushed. And unlike the hollow statue of Helos, Magath listens. He has full authority, and that is exactly what happens. The counterattack starts nigh instantly with just Marley's units. That's enough future memories. Returning back in time, Magath tells Willy that they're rats, aka traitors in Marley, and that an attack of some kind is imminent. Over the years, many have wondered, how did he even know this was happening? Paradis' attack during the festival is kind of insane. How did he predict all of this? While there is no explicit answer, I think it's more so meant to be this vibe that just something is off. First, there is Zeke's odd comment about not in this room. Secondly, even Udo can figure out that this plan of let's get the boys together and deliver Marley in justice is just pure fantasy. And by extension, number 3, these nations, they hate Marley. Is the idea really to bring all of them here? What are the chances that at least one of them doesn't try something? And the thing is, the only thing Magath actually gets right is the vibe. He doesn't actually predict what's going to happen, he just knows that something is going to happen. There are multiple attacks happening, not just the, well, quite explosive attack. There is Paradis and Eren launching a full-blown raid. There is Yelena, who has been an inside agent for years, and then there's the entire anti-Marley group. There is Zeke, who is the mastermind behind this entire scheme, and even beyond all of that, there is also the Atsumabito family, who too is subtly working against Marley. And even beyond that, realistically, there are probably even more, and we just don't focus on them for the sake of not bloating the story. So yeah, Magath does not predict Eren's attack, he just predicts that Marley is going to be attacked from within by someone. The goal of this is to create a false flag operation. They're going to bait out an attack from whoever it might be and pin the blame on Paradis. Everyone will have lost someone in this festival, and so they all now want to fight Paradis. We also get this really cool shot of them being positioned back to back, which I think you could interpret them as sort of being pushed into a corner and now having to watch each other's back. Or maybe you could also look at it as them having entirely different views on the world but still aligning. Whatever the case, it is a really cool shot. I think a super underrated scene here is Willy talking about the weight of this decision and really the weight of the crown. It's too heavy to bear and he just wants to give it up. But at the same time, he wants to live free of that burden that he has carried around all this time, but he just got unlucky. Debts are due and he'll be the one to pay. He must become a martyr for Marley and Eldia. But that relief of that guilt is not sweet freedom, it's horrifying and it's death. It's just another great example of Isayama writing living, breathing characters who, say it with me now, are often self-contradictory. Willy can fully accept that he has caused so much death and that he must pay. He has fully accepted it, he will happily put his life on the line and he will become a martyr for them. But then, why does he feel bad? Isn't this what he wants, what he knows he has to do? He always knew this day would come, so why is he struggling now? Is that contradiction that I think just makes it feel real. Also, another complete side note, but one thing I haven't really seen people discuss is the question of, was there ever a backup plan? As in, Willy must become a martyr, that is the goal of this entire thing. So, did they have a false flag operation of their own, just in case no one attacked, like right now? Did they have, like, explosives planted around the stage or something? It would be needless bloat for the story, yes, but it's definitely interesting to think about at least. We then cut to Eren and Falco, with him congratulating him for finally beating Gabby. Before we get to them talking though, I talked about this plenty with the wall reveal, no not that one, and not that one either, like the third one, Eren adopting the name of Kruger, aka the Owl, while the Owl's name was Eren, and Grisha naming Eren after the Owl, but then Eren choosing the name of Kruger, I think is another example of that constant through line of inheritance. And with Eren specifically, there is the additional layer of it also being a sort of a loop and the whole timey-wimey shenanigans. That aside though, Falco then talks about how he's not even sure he can surpass Gabby this late into the grading, but then says that at least he can push forward with a clear head. I think this right here is the tragic double-edged sword of Eren's advice. On one hand, he cares about Falco, he wants him to live a long life, and to a certain extent, he also wants him to succeed in whatever he wants to do, even if that means becoming an enemy of his. Eren's story is all about individual freedoms. So giving Falco advice that allows him to get one step closer to fulfilling that dream of saving Gabby very much tracks. But at the same time, he is also being used as just a pawn. Everything that happens from this point onward will, in parts, happen because Falco delivered that letter. All that death, all that destruction was helped with that letter. So sure, he might be moving forward with a clear head now, but Eren just burdened him with something far, far worse. Also, the baseball glove and the ball connect right to the Eren Zeke meetings we see later in the flashbacks, but at this point, it's obviously just a major hint that they have indeed made contact. But the, I don't really want to say funny because it's high-key messed up, but still amusing thing here is, Eren casually saying he needs to keep moving forward too, then saying that he's going to go home after the festival. And if you remember the whole they march right into hell speech from last time, Falco's moving forward with a clear head is in pursuit of that hope that lies through that hell. Eren's not so much. And if you think about what he's saying for just a second longer, the festival is meant to be a declaration of war and the founding of a joint military. So, Mr. Kruger, what do you mean you're going to be going home? A draft is ongoing. You couldn't go home. Unless your home is? But wait, there's more, because the next person Eren talks to on his little therapy bench is his own grandfather. He knows that Falco's uncle was one of the Eldia restorationists, that of course being Grice, the dude who recruited Grisha in the first place. And that also may or may not be the reason why Eren repeatedly seeks out Falco in the first place. Perhaps he does feel somehow indebted to him, as in he feels like he needs to liberate him now that he has no father to do it for him. But Eren then just asks, why are you telling me this? To which old Yeager says, Falco is already safe. His family will all become honorary Marleyans because Colt is inheriting the Beast Titan. Then telling him, stop having Falco run these cryptic errands. Remember that old Yeager was just like Karina. He was deathly afraid of entertaining anything to do with Eldia and tried drilling Marley propaganda into Grisha, and later on, even more so in Zeke. Grisha was sent to Paradis, but Zeke became a warrior, even further cementing his ideology as the correct one. It was the strictest adherence to Marley's rule that not only kept them safe, but brought them out from being the parents of an Eldia restorationist to actual honorary Marleyans. So now seeing this sus dude asking someone like Falco to run errands for him, especially going beyond the walls of the internment zones, well, that is very uncomfortable for him. And that is when we get the twist. Dr. Yeager is a doctor, yes, but in many ways, he is also a patient here. When Eren notes that it seems like he's talking from experience, something he obviously knows for a fact is indeed happening, Yeager starts getting incredibly intense and vivid flashbacks of Faye's death, with him just starting to mumble about how if he wasn't that hard on Grisha, maybe it would have never happened. This is another crystal clear example of that continued cycle of inheritance and the horror that comes from it. Every generation pushes their ideals onto the next. They try to strip them of their own free will and just telling them that don't ask questions, this is how it's supposed to be. We've seen that with royal successions like Willy and Historia. We've seen that with Titan successions like the Warriors, the Founding Titan, or even the Attack Titan. It's that succession that breaks every one of them. That is why the cycle is only broken when Historia throws away the crown and lives on a lone farmhouse. When Gabby and Falco never become the next Warriors. When the Titans just cease to exist. Only problem is, humans are like the most intelligent species on the planet, but they also seem to be the dumbest. There was a huge war that everyone felt 80% of the world was wiped out, but eventually they broke the cycle. There was a version of peace. Until there wasn't. That is the horror side of this, because they also inherited a really bad history. One side of Yeager hates Grisha for tearing their family apart, for ever taking Faye past the wall, for constantly asking questions that he just shouldn't be asking. But another side of him hates himself for all of those same reasons. It was his son after all. His son did not trust him. It was he who betrayed his trust. And yet another side of him just hates all of this. And so his mind just can't bear all that pain and regrets. As he's taken away, we see the baseball thrown up into the air. Later in the series, that baseball is used as a sign that Eren was never on the same page as Zeke. But in this sequence, I do think it's trying to imply that they are indeed on the same page. Eren just saw his own grandfather tearing his face apart, so when you think about his meeting with Zeke and the euthanasia plan and just never being born, in this particular sequence, I do think it's trying to make you think that Eren is indeed playing ball. Which, by the way, let's take a step back for a second and think about how ridiculous what we're talking about is. Do you know another series where a person not catching a baseball is like one of the biggest twists in the entire series? It's so good. Also, obligatory Mappa Eyes mention. This is one of the greatest frames in the entire series. There is no other option, there is no other comment. This is just a fact. Also, the OST throughout the sequence is excellent. The way it builds that unease is so good. As evening falls, the big party announcing the festival begins. First of all, seeing the wine bottles, knowing where and how they end up is definitely uncanny, and these also may or may not be the same ones we already saw in Utgard. Still speaking of wine though, Udo accidentally spills some on Atsumabito, but as soon as she sees that he's wearing an armband, she immediately covers for him, saying that she spilt it on herself and that he was just helping her clean up. So again, if you think back to the rats in the house, here it is. The Atsumabito family treating the Eldians as, well, just people, is already an indication that this whole global alliance will not be a monolith that they might have imagined. Their cultures don't match, their beliefs don't match, their ideologies don't match, nothing about them is the same except for the fact that they were conquered and brought into this pseudo-alliance. It's also mentioned that she's from a country in the Orient, so that right there is the Mikasa connection. Unfortunately, even if you were a turbo nerd, there is no way to connect the symbol though. We never got to see the embroidery, and we've never seen the tattoo either, so that's kind of a thing that is only revealed later. But as Willy arrives, we get, yes, yet another one of my favorite tracks in the entire series. This is the piano and violin version of Liberio at Night, and it high-key gives me like old-school Minecraft vibes. It's so good. Another small thing to note here, if I said seeing a suit in Attack on Titan is weird, then these wide shots of dozens of different cultures certainly drives that home even more. Intuitively, we know that the rest of the world obviously exists. But with just how focused the story had been up to this point, I think it does constantly give you a vibe check about just how large that world beyond the walls really is. There's also the goofy scene of the dude saying, yesterday's enemy is today's enemy. Wait, my bad, yesterday's enemy is today's friend. And while it's obviously dramatized and seems borderline comedic, I think it does illustrate just how fragile this alliance is, and he also quite literally says that that prejudice never went away. Like, he just literally said, yesterday's enemy is still today's enemy, you know? It's kind of supposed to be a mistake, but that's what's actually happening. Just like nothing changed with Reiner, is the same thing here. The moment he has this supposed slip-up, we see the faces of, again, a lot of different cultures, all united and all very annoyed at him, ready to spill blood. Not helped by the fact that this dude is just dismissing what was a very bloody war as a unpleasant dispute over resources. So for like the 15th time this episode, this alliance is not an alliance. If the whole martyr plan didn't happen, the moment Marley showed like the tiniest bit of weakness, they would be torn apart. Luckily for them though, Willy is a whole lot more elegant with words, so he just writes it off as a goofy language barrier thing and quickly scoots him away. That immediate 180 in the public is a pretty good indication that this plan really is a break glass in case of emergency type of deal. I don't think this is just because he's a royal, there does seem to be genuine admiration for him. To the public, he has seemed like just a nice, rich dude who purposely distanced himself from the military state that is Marley. In reality though, we know that it is his inaction that allowed this to become a problem in the first place. But point is, like we saw earlier in the episode, there was always the assumption that this is going to be the perfect PR person that would have to be sacrificed in case Marley was tearing itself apart. And the speech he goes on is just a cherry on top. Right away, he puts himself on the same exact level as Eldians, not shying away from the whole devil's blood insults and everything else. And as we zoom out to see the hollow statue of Helos, he proclaims that everything will be announced during the festival. And so with that, Willy has gone through the casting process in one fell swoop. And the final thing we see in this episode is, again, just a goofy little scene to establish the starkest of contrasts. Remember that this festival is a massive deal. The candidates have never seen anything like this. And so, their entire squad, and especially Gabby, is just munching on everything and anything they can get their hands on. Also, the gag of Reiner always being the one to pay in the background will never not be funny to me. Isayama, please write like a alternate Attack on Titan Season 4 where Reiner just becomes the cool uncle and there is no bad stuff at all. It's just peace and Reiner is just the cool uncle. This is Attack on Titan though, so we don't get that, like, at all. As we see him smile, the ED fades in, which, as I think all of us know very well, a mic drop moment is about to follow. This time, that comes from Gabby, who, against the setting sun, says, "I get the feeling something big's gonna change soon." To which Reiner responds with just a simple,
Yeah, I hear you.
and oh boy, is that a loaded line. I haven't really talked about it much throughout this episode, but notice that Reiner is subtly no longer a POV character. I think this tells us exactly why. His perspective on the festival isn't curiosity or naivete or some grand scheme. To him, it is misery, it is bloodshed, it is more of killing his own friends, and generally, just a whole lot of bad. So dropping this super raw soldier's perspective on this grand festival right at the end here, I think hits really hard. This time, that mic drop moment was so intense that even the creative team couldn't resist putting in a post-credits scene. As everyone is gathering up for the festival, we go full circle. Once again, Falco is just running around for something. Only this time, he doesn't just run off, he asks Reiner to follow him. Obviously, Reiner trusts him, so he does just follow along with whatever he might want to show him. Maybe the little dude has built a gym for himself. He did beat Gabby, right? Maybe he has some other cool thing he wants to show off. Who knows? Reiner is the cool uncle. Of course he'll play along.
4年ぶりだな、ライナー。
This is where I would normally just cut the script and it would be this sudden, abrupt ending, but this shot of Falco looking super excited is hilarious. And it's also very dark, which makes it all the more hilarious, so look at Falco. He's so excited. And with that, that is episode 63. The title is actually not clickbait. I genuinely think this is one of the most underrated episodes in the entire series. The conversation between Willy and Magath, it's so good. I wish ECM wrote more of this stuff. We do see a little bit of that in the flashbacks later on with Paradis as well, but why didn't we see more of that? I want to see more politics. Please, ECM, write a prequel. Please give me entire royal families clashing for the power of the Titans. Please. Please make them backstab each other. Have these false flag operations. It would be so cool. But anyway, that is enough of my yapping because the next couple of episodes, they're going to be very big. And yeah, it's time for the Reiner and Eren conversation. So, I hope to see you back as we continue overanalyzing Attack on Titan. Again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to play it for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile devices by using my links in the description or in the pinned comments. If you're a new or returning player, there's a big package of goodies already waiting for you. It's only available for a limited time, so don't miss it. And that's the video. I know I already said this a few weeks ago, but we are about to be caught up to when I started the YouTube channel, and that is just wild to me. It's also kind of funny that 4 years later, I'm still talking about the same thing, so I don't know what that says about me either. But yeah, one final thing I want to mention here is that I'll be starting my Dark Souls 2 first time playthrough on the Twitch channel, so if you want to see me suffer through that, Dark Souls 1 was very fun. I'm expecting Dark Souls 2 to be a little bit less fun, but I'm sure it's going to be a blast. I haven't started it yet, but that's something that's happening in probably like a week at most. But yes, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team, Colby and Marina Kucherieva, I think. I'm sorry if I butchered the name. But without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.